Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the northern Appalachian Mountains. A story that makes us question everything we thought we knew about the limits of human nature and the secrets that some families have kept for generations. Tell us where you're watching from and get ready for what you're about to learn. It will leave a mark. This video is a work of fiction that was made just for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Dead is just a coincidence. In 1913, the highlands of West Virginia still had communities that were cut off from the rest of the world. There weren't many roads, and most properties didn't have phones. It took the law days to get to the deepest valleys. In that area of thick forests and constant fog, there were places where time seemed to stand still, and old ways of life were more important than any new ones that tried to get into those mountains. The Harrow family lived on a large estate in Tucker County, which is a very remote area, even by the standards of the time. The main house was a strong, dark wood building. There were barns, stables, and other smaller buildings all over the property. People say that the Harrows family grew tobacco and raised cattle, but not many of their neighbors knew much about their lives. They stayed away from town most of the time, and when they did go, they always did so quietly. Silas Harrow, the head of the family, was a tall man who scared people. Martha, his wife, was rarely seen. People saw her, but when she did, she always looked down, as if she were carrying a heavy load. At that time, it was common for several generations of a family to live under the same roof. Even the people who lived there and were used to the roughness of the mountains were bothered by how the Harrows acted. The rumors started quietly. A merchant who brought supplies to the property said he heard strange noises coming from the basement of the main house. Another traveler who needed a place to stay during a storm said that some rooms were locked and doors couldn't be opened. But things were different back then. People respected other people's privacy, especially when it came to powerful private families like the Harrows. The first revelations didn't come out until one of the workers hired to plant the trees was able to get away from the property. The man came to the closest town in shock and started talking about things he had seen in a way that didn't make sense. He talked about his family members, who were never seen during the day, acted strangely during meals, and had a family hierarchy that was almost ridiculous. Many people would rather have thought he was crazy than believe what he said, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Others started to remember odd things, like how the family never let anyone visit, how they bought strange amounts of some supplies, and how there was always smoke coming from a certain chimney, even in the heat of summer. Small pieces that didn't mean anything on their own but did when they were put together. Began to paint a scary picture. Local officials finally decided to look into the matter after hearing more and more rumors, but getting to the Harrow property was not easy. The road there was dangerous because it crossed streams and went up steep hills. It was as if geography itself wanted to keep that place separate from the rest of the world. Maybe that's what the family wanted from the start. When the sheriff and his men finally got to the property, people were not happy to see them. Silas Harrow stood in the way and said that his house was his castle and that no one had the right to invade his privacy without proof. It was a good point at the time, and the sheriff had to back down without a formal warrant. But the rumors were true, as seen in Silas's eyes and the tension that hung over the property. We'll find out what really happened in that lonely mountain house together. The Harrow family's secrets, kept, were darker than anyone could have thought. The next few days brought a lot of tension to that mountain area. The sheriff couldn't stop thinking about the look on Silas Harrow's face, that mix of defiance and something deeper, something that seemed to hide layers of secrets that had built up over the years. The property was still there, quiet and impossible to get to, while the town buzzed with rumors. Few people knew Martha Harrow's strange story. She was the head of the family. She had gotten to that area. From somewhere in Kentucky around 1889, brought by Silas after families with old beliefs about blood purity and lineage arranged a marriage between them. At that time, these kinds of marriages were not uncommon in the mountains, where whole communities formed around certain clans that wanted to keep their traditions hidden from the modern world. The Harrow estate covered hundreds of acres, and some of it was so dense with trees that sunlight barely got through. There were stories of trails that led to empty cabins and old buildings that had belonged to the family's ancestors. Some people said those buildings were built before the Civil War, when laws were even less strict and families made their own rules in the Appalachian highlands. Thomas Webb, the worker who had run away, eventually calmed down enough to give more information. He talked about the strange way that family members ran that house. Some family members seemed to be in charge of things. Some people were completely obedient, while others had unquestionable authority. There were strict rules about who could talk and when meals were served. Thomas said he saw doors locked from the outside, windows boarded up, and that heavy silence that hung over everything all the time. But there was more to what Thomas said than what he was willing to say. He talked about hearing voices coming from places in the house where no one should be, and footsteps at night in the hallways of family members who never came out during the day, as if they lived in a cycle that was completely the opposite of what it was supposed to be. It seemed like two families lived in the same space, one of which was easy to see and the other of which was hidden in the shadows. People in the area started to remember other things that had been forgotten. There was a story about a doctor who had to go to the property in 1907 to help with an emergency. The doctor never talked about what he saw, but people who knew him well saw a change in how he acted after that visit. He started to. They didn't want to talk about the Harrows and turned down requests to go back to the property, no matter how urgent or how much money was offered. People also started to notice the things the family bought. A lot of basic foods, as well as some things that seemed strange for a farming family. Big chains, strong padlocks, and thick fabrics to cover windows. The blacksmith in town remembered making special grills for Silas on request. Grills that looked like they were meant to keep something in instead of out. The mountains around the property had their own stories. Old stories about families who had moved so far away from civilization that they made their own strange versions of society. Stories about families that believed in strict hierarchies, where each member had a role from the moment they were born. It was unthinkable to question that order. Everyone thought these stories were just folk tales, but the Harrow seemed to be the living embodiment of them. The fog that covered that part of the Appalachians had an almost like magic. As night fell, it came down from the mountains and covered the Harrow property in a gray blanket, making it even more cut off from the rest of the world. People who traveled through the area at night said they saw dim lights in the house's upper windows. Lights that blinked and moved around in a strange way, making it seem like there was always something going on, even late at night. The sheriff knew he would need more than just hearsay to get a search warrant. At the time, the laws were very strict about protecting private property, especially in the countryside, where the government wasn't very strong. He would need solid proof, like witness testimony or physical proof, that something illegal was going on that property. But how could he get that when everyone who knew about it was either inside the house or too scared to say anything? The air in the area got thicker and thicker. It was like everyone knew that something bad was hiding in those mountains, but no one had the guts or the means to face the truth head-on. In the spring of 1913, there were heavy rains in the West Virginia mountains. The streams overflowed, the roads turned to mud, and it was even harder to get to the Harrow property. It was as if nature itself was working against the family to keep their secrets, putting up physical barriers between them and the outside world. No one could get in touch with them for weeks, and the family didn't come down to town. At the same time, Thomas Webb kept telling bits and pieces of his story. He talked about the house's internal structure and how some rooms seemed to have been changed over the years to serve unknown purposes. There were doors that led to stairs going down, hallways that ended in solid walls, and fake windows painted on the inside walls to make the space look bigger. The house was a maze meant to confuse and control people. The way the family members interacted with each other bothered Thomas the most. He said that some people seemed to only exist to help others, as if their own wills had been completely erased. There was a strict but invisible hierarchy where small things made a big difference. People obeyed commands that were given through looks and gestures right away. At every moment of the day, there was a silent dance of power and submission. Thomas said that Martha Harrow was a very mysterious person. She moved around the house like a ghost, always there but never really taking part. Her eyes were full of sadness, as if she had seen things that had broken something deep inside her. But she also seemed to be an important part of that system, keeping it going through her. Passive presence, the same patterns that had taken over her. Research in county archives started to bring up stories about the family's past generations. The Harrows had strong ties to that area that went back to when there weren't many laws. There were records of properties that had been bought, marriages between distant cousins, and people who chose to stay away from other communities. It was like the family had purposefully created a separate world with its own strange rules. The old merchant told stories about his. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the Harrow family, like how they treated each other, and how power structures were passed down from one generation to the next without ever being questioned. There were talks of punishments for not following the rules and reward and control systems that shaped behavior from a young age. People always told these stories in low voices, as if they were still afraid of what would happen to them even decades later. As summer got closer, the weather in the mountains started to change. The fog went away, and the days became clear and warm. But the Harrow estate stayed dark in its own way. It was a mental darkness, a shadow that went beyond the house's walls and affected everyone who knew what was going on inside. Then a new witness came forward, someone who had worked for the family years ago. A woman who was hired to help with housework but quit after a few weeks. She talked about how the air was so heavy. Of the house, where every word and action was watched and judged. She said she saw family members in states of extreme submission, moving around the house like robots, as if they had been taught to hide any signs of being different. But what bothered her the most was the constant feeling that someone was watching her. Someone was always in the shadows, watching her every move. There were a lot of secondary corridors and passageways in the house that let people move around without being seen. Some family members could move around the whole property without anyone else noticing, making an invisible network of surveillance and control. The woman also talked about the noises that happened at night when the house should have been quiet. There were sounds coming from deep inside the building. The sounds weren't scary or violent. They were more like a constant murmur of activity, as if there was a whole life going on in layers that visitors couldn't see. It was like there were two worlds going on in the house at the same time, one that could be seen and one that couldn't. The authorities started to understand that what they were dealing with was much more complicated than they had first thought. It wasn't just a single crime that could have happened. It was a whole system that had been built and improved over many generations. The Harrow family had made their own world in those mountains, a world where rules went against everything society thought was normal or okay. Summer was moving forward, and the authorities were under more and more pressure. The sheriff talked to officials from nearby counties to get their advice on what to do next. The situation was delicate because it involved a family with a lot of property and long-standing ties to the area. If you make a mistake, you could have to deal with a fight or be accused of abusing your power, but it was no longer possible to ignore the reports either. Silas Harrow did something unexpected when he saw that the net was closing in. For the first time, he came down to town. In months. with 2 family members. The streets went quiet right away when he showed up. People stopped what they were doing and watched the tall, scary man walk with purpose to the sheriff's office. It was a show of power that made it clear he wasn't afraid of the police. People outside could hear the sheriff and Silas talking, even though they were behind closed doors. Silas said that unhappy workers were spreading false information about his family and rumors in a small town. He said that everything on his property was in perfect order, and that his family just valued privacy and old traditions. His words were convincing, and he spoke with the authority of someone who is used to being obeyed without question. But there was something in Silas's eyes that showed he wasn't really concerned about the accusations being made. He was cold and didn't seem to care at all. He seemed to see other people as chess pieces that he could move around or get rid of when necessary. The sheriff got a chill down his spine during that talk, an instinctive sense that something was very wrong. Things started to happen that were strange after Silas came. Witnesses, who had been honest about the family, suddenly changed their stories or refused to say anything else. The merchant who had talked about the weird sounds suddenly sold his business and moved away. The woman who worked in the house shut herself off completely and wouldn't talk to anyone about it. Subject: it was like an invisible hand was using methods that no one could prove, but everyone could feel to quiet voices. The worker who started it all, Thomas Webb, began to show signs of extreme anxiety. He moved to a faraway county, but even there he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was following him. He wrote a letter to the sheriff saying he didn't want to be involved in the investigation anymore because he was afraid for his safety. As he read the letter, it shook in the sheriff's hands, dripping with real fear. During this time, the Harrow property was even more closed off than it had been before. There were no workers hired. There were no requests for deliveries. It was like the family had decided to cut themselves off from everyone else to show that they could live on their own. The fences around the property were made stronger, and signs saying private property were put up in key places. The message was clear: don't go near. Life went on in that fortress of wood and secrets, following the same patterns, set up generations ago. Martha moved through the halls in a quiet dance of survival. The younger family members did their jobs with mechanical accuracy. Silas was in charge of everything from the center, like a spider in the middle of its web. He could feel and control every vibration and every thread that was connected to him. The seasons came and went, but that house stayed stuck in time. It was like the normal rules of change and progress didn't work there, while the rest of As the country slowly moved toward modernity and ideas about rights and human dignity spread, the Harrow estate was like a time bubble where old hierarchies ruled. The sheriff was in a tough spot. He was morally sure that something bad was going on that property, but he didn't have enough legal proof to do anything about it. All of the witnesses had been threatened or silenced. There were no bodies, no formal complaints from family members, and no clear law violations to point to. 2, it was a perfect prison that didn't have real walls, but instead used fear, mental control, and being alone. The nights in that part of the mountains got bigger. People who weren't directly involved in the situation still felt a heavy atmosphere, as if the weight of the Harrow family's secrets spread through the fog and affected everyone. Everyone felt powerless, like they were seeing something very wrong but couldn't do anything about it. The house stayed there, strong and impenetrable, with windows like eyes that were empty, looking out at the mountains around them. For generations, distorted patterns kept going on inside. Every day, structures that should have been broken long ago were strengthened, and Silas Harrow ruled over it all, untouchable and absolute, protected by walls of privilege, isolation, and carefully cultivated fear. The mountains got their muted colors in the fall, turning the trees blood red and burnt orange. The Harrow estate looked even sadder against this background, as if nature itself seemed to be reflecting the darkness that was in the area. Leaves fell in quiet streams, covering the paths that led to the main house. This made layers and layers of secrets that had been hidden for a long time. Around this time, something unexpected happened that changed the way people saw the situation. Someone from the Harrow family who lived far away and had left those mountains decades ago came back to the area. He was Edward Harrow, and he had left when he was young to find a new life in the eastern towns. He came back with gray hair and hands that showed he had worked hard. He brought back memories he had tried to forget for years. Edward didn't come in secret. He took the train to the nearest station and then hired a horse to take him the rest of the way to the city. His presence caused an immediate stir, because everyone knew that any Harrow who left that family rarely came back, and when they did, it was never for simple reasons. People whispered stories about those who tried to leave the family and what they had to pay for that choice. The sheriff found out about Edward's arrival within hours. They met at the small inn where Edward was staying, and for the first time in months, the sheriff felt a glimmer of hope. Edward was different from Silas and the other family members who stayed on the property. He seemed light and human, as if distance and time away from that place had kept him that way. Edward started to talk, and what he said made the picture even worse than what any other witness had been able to describe. He talked about growing up in that house and how there had always been rules that no one could see that controlled every part of life. There were rules about who could talk to whom, where each person could go on the property, and hierarchies that were clear and unbreakable. He talked about how some family members were treated like servants, with their wills completely under the control of those in higher positions. But what Edward told us about the house's physical structure was even more showing. He made simple maps that showed hidden rooms behind false walls, secret passages and basements that went much deeper than the outside of the building suggested. Over the years, the house was built as a maze to make it easier to control and watch over. There were secret places to watch where you couldn't be seen, and narrow hallways that let you move between the main floors without making noise. Edward was very sad when he talked about Martha. She had changed since she got there. She was full of life and hope. But there was something in that house, something about how the family worked, that slowly put out that light. He remembered how she had changed over the years, how she had given in to impossible expectations, and a reality that didn't let her fight back. Martha had turned into a shadow, a person who was only there to keep up the appearance of a normal family. The rules that ran that house were complicated and had many parts. There were mental punishments for breaking the rules, forced isolation for people who questioned the order, rewards that were conditional, and made people dependent and loyal in a way that wasn't real. It was a way to control people that had been improved over generations, with each patriarch adding his own layers of manipulation and control. Silas had taken over this system and made it better, making him the best executive. Edward talked about how the family kept control over people who might want to leave. There were issues with manipulated inheritances and property documents that kept people from moving on, threats that weren't clear about what would happen if secrets were told. But more than anything else, there was the psychological burden of years of conditioning. From a young age, they were taught that the outside world was dangerous and that the family, no matter how dysfunctional, was the only safe place. He talked about the sounds at night that had upset the other witnesses so much. They were family members doing their jobs, going through secret passageways and always being on the lookout for threats. Was a key part of Silas's control. The house never really slept because the system of control needed constant attention, monitoring, and an invisible but always felt presence. Changes to the house over the years were not random. In the family's twisted logic, Each change had a specific reason for being made. Windows are blocked so that people can't talk to each other. Doors that locked from the outside to keep some people inside. Corridors made to confuse and making people dependent and making it hard to get away. The house's physical structure was a clear reflection of the family's mental structure. Edward said that leaving had been hard for him. He had to plan in secret for months, gathering hidden resources and waiting for the right time when surveillance was least strict. Even years after leaving those mountains, he still had nightmares about being found and made to go back. It had taken him years to fully understand what he had experienced and realized that it wasn't normal for families to work that way. The sheriff listened in silence, and with each new piece of information he understood the situation better. He was dealing with something that went beyond just one crime. It was a whole system of abuse that had been going on for generations. It was so normal in that family that many members couldn't even think of a different way to live. The Harrow property was more than just a house. It was a mental prison where the chains were real but not visible. Edward talked about other family members who had tried to get away over the years. Some people were able to do what he did, but they had to deal with a lot of trauma and feeling alone. People found others and brought them back. Their attempts to escape were used as examples of what happened to people who went against the rules. And there were people who just gave up trying and accepted living in that system because the other options seemed too scary or impossible. The talk went on into the night. Edward didn't come back because he missed the past or wanted to make things right. He came back because he heard rumors of an investigation and thought it was finally time to tell the truth. He'd been carrying that weight by himself for too long. Maybe his story could make a difference now and help other family members break free from that cycle of violence. But Edward also brought bad news. Silas wouldn't give in easily. He would see any outside help as a threat to the order he stood for and protected. The family had money, connections, and most importantly, decades of experience keeping their secrets safe. It would be dangerous to face the Harrows head-on. Not always in terms of physical violence, but in terms of legal manipulation, social pressure, and the family's ability to make people disappear without a trace. The mountains were getting ready for the winter as fall came to an end. The area always had a harsh winter. The Harrow estate stayed quiet and oppressive, but now someone was ready to speak up. Edward Harrow had traveled across the country to face his past, and his presence changed the balance of power that had been in place for so long. Silas heard about Edward's presence in the area as quickly as a cutting wind coming down from the mountains. His response wasn't immediate, but when it came, it was planned and exact, just like everything that Silas did. This time, he didn't go down to the city himself. Instead, he sent messengers, loyal family members who treated his words like they were holy orders. It was clear what the message to Edward was. Go back home. If you don't take your place in the family, you'll have to deal with the consequences of your betrayal. Edward said no. He stood up to Silas for the first time in his life, and this refusal sent shockwaves through the family power structure that had been in place for so long. It was, not just against one man, but against a whole system of control that thrived on total and unquestioning obedience. Seeing this bravery made the sheriff more determined to do something. The authorities finally had enough evidence to ask for a search warrant after Edward gave a detailed account and drew maps of the property. The process took a long time and was full of problems with the government. The Harrow family had power in places you wouldn't expect. Links that went back. Decades of favors built up over generations. But in the end, the sheriff's determination and Edward's clear testimony won out. As the court case went on, strange things started to happen on the property. It looked like things were being burned quickly because smoke was coming out of the chimneys at strange times. People saw wagons leaving the property at night with heavy tarps covering their loads. It was clear that Silas was getting rid of evidence, covering his tracks, and getting the house ready for outside inspection. Check. Everyone knew it was a race against time. Edward started getting visits every night during this time. He didn't think they were direct threats, but he felt like there were shadows that followed him through the streets of the small town. Family members he could see from a distance, watching him from dark corners, silently reminding him that he was still within the long arm of the Harrows. But Edward had crossed a line of no return. He knew that moving forward and making sure the truth was fully known was the only way to stay safe. The sheriff gave Edward secret protection from trusted men who watched over him without being obvious. The whole town was on edge, with some people supporting the investigation and others afraid of what would happen if they went against such a powerful family. People were talking in low voices in the corners. They looked at each other in silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something that was going to happen. Meanwhile, Martha Harrow had become even more mysterious. Figure. People who could see the property from a distance said they saw her in the upper windows, looking at the mountains with an unreadable look on her face. Her posture showed that she was in conflict with herself. Part of her wanted the system to finally fall apart, but another part was so deeply connected to it that she couldn't imagine living outside of it. Edward told specific stories about Martha that showed how complicated her situation was. She wasn't just a passive, a victim of the system, but also a part of its continuation because she needed to in order to stay alive. She made sure that other family members followed the rules, which helped keep the peace in the house that Silas had set up. It was a sad example of how systems of oppression can turn even those who are hurt by them into people who help them keep going. In the middle of November 1913, the warrant was finally issued. The sheriff got the paper on a cold morning when the first snow of the year began to fall. Cover the mountains. It was just a piece of paper, but it had the legal authority to let him into that gated property. The sheriff called together his men, which included officers from nearby counties. They knew they would need significant numbers, not necessarily because of the expectation of violent resistance, but because of the vastness of the property and the complexity of the structure they would need to investigate. Edward insisted on accompanying them. Even though the sheriff said it was dangerous, Edward said that his presence would be very important, even though people were worried about safety. He knew the house well enough to know where to look for the secret rooms and hidden passages that no one else would be able to find. His insistence also had another more personal and profound reason. He needed to confront that place again. He needed to see with his own adult eyes what his memory had preserved through the years. The journey to the property began at dawn. The group was considerable, more than a dozen men on horseback, climbing the steep trails that led into the heart of the mountains. The snow made the path treacherous, but also created a ghostly beauty, as if nature were preparing the scene for the confrontation to come. The bare trees stretched like skeletal fingers against the gray sky, and the silence was broken only by the sound of hooves on the snow and the heavy breathing of the horses. As they drew closer, the Harrow estate emerged from the landscape like a medieval fortress. The main house dominated a rise, Several chimneys were spewing smoke that mixed with the morning fog. There were secondary buildings all over the place, like sentinels and fences that clearly marked the family's territory. It was an imposing sight designed to intimidate and assert dominance over that parcel of land. They were greeted at the gates by Silas and several family members. There was no surprise on their faces. They had clearly expected this visit. Silas was impeccably dressed, his posture erect and defiant even in the face of the legal authority the sheriff represented. His eyes retained the same coldness that always characterized his gaze. But now there was something more. a contained anger that pulsed just beneath the carefully controlled surface. The confrontation between Silas and Edward was tense. The two men stared at each other through the gate, and in that moment, generations of family history seemed to collide. Silas saw in Edward not only a departed relative, but an existential threat to the order he had dedicated his life to maintaining. Edward saw in Silas the personification of everything he had fled, the architect of a system that had broken so many people, including himself. Silas attempted one last control maneuver. He demanded to know the specific charges under which they were trespassing on his property, arguing about privacy rights and the protection of private property. His words were articulate, his knowledge of the law surprisingly detailed for someone so isolated. But the sheriff was prepared. He presented the warrant, detailed the charges based on the collected testimonies, and made it clear that they would enter with or without cooperation. At that moment, Silas's face changed. Something of the recognition that his absolute control was finally being challenged in a way he couldn't simply manipulate or intimidate. For a brief second, his mask of unwavering authority trembled, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. But it was only a second. He quickly composed himself, opened the gates with an exaggerated gesture, and invited them in with barely disguised sarcasm. The group crossed the gate, and for the first time outside, authorities were inside the Harrow property for investigative purposes. The house stood before them, its windows dark as empty eyes, its thick walls guarding generations' secrets. Edward took a deep breath, preparing to revisit the corridors of his past. The sheriff adjusted his hat, aware of the historical weight of that moment, and Silas observed everything with a calculating gaze, already planning his next moves in the chess game. He still believed he could win. The snow continued to fall gently, covering the property with a white blanket that seemed incongruously pure for a place so stained by years of control and subjugation. The surrounding mountains remained silent, ancient witnesses to all that had happened there, finally about to see their secrets exposed to the light of day. Going into the house felt like going back in time. The air inside was thick and heavy with the smell of smoke and old wood. There was a weight in the air that seemed to press against his lungs, coming from the wood fire, and something else that was hard to put into words. The hallways were dark and narrow, and the only light came from lamps that made shadows move on the walls. Edward felt a wave of memories wash over him, every corner of the house, awakening recollections he had tried to bury. Martha was in the main room, seated in a high-backed chair like a queen on a decaying throne. She didn't raise her eyes when the group entered, keeping her gaze fixed on her hands clasped in her lap. Her presence was spectral, as if she were part of the furniture, a fixed element of that house that had long since lost any agency of its own. The officers noticed her rigid posture, the way her shoulders remained tense even in apparent repose. The sheriff began the inspection methodically, following legal protocol as Edward pointed out the most relevant locations. The house revealed its true nature as they explored its levels. There were rooms that clearly served as communal dormitories where multiple family members slept in cramped conditions, while other wings of the house boasted spacious quarters reserved for the upper hierarchy. The inequality was architectural, built into the very walls and distribution of space. Edward guided them to a specific door in the second-floor hallway. It seemed ordinary at first glance, but when opened, it revealed descending stairs that were not visible in the house's exterior layout. The stairs led to an intermediate level, a kind of hidden mezzanine between the main floors. There, small rooms had been built, claustrophobic spaces with tiny or non-existent windows. These were accommodations for those family members in lower positions in the hierarchy, places where they were kept separate, isolated, even within the house itself. The most disturbing discovery came when Edward led them to the main basement. It wasn't simply a storage space, but a complex system of interconnected rooms. Some contained normal supplies, but others had more sinister purposes. There was a room with chains fixed to the walls, not rusted from disuse, but polished by frequent touch. Another room contained meticulous records, books where family members' infractions were noted, punishments supplied, and the credit and debit systems that governed privileges within the family structure. The officers leaped through these records with growing horror. There were decades of documentation on control, pages and pages detailing minor transgressions and the disproportionate responses they received. There were notes on periods of isolation, food restrictions used as punishment, forced labor assigned for disobedience. It was an elaborate system of psychological domination made tangible through meticulous bureaucracy. Silas observed everything with an increasingly closed expression. He offered no explanations or justifications, maintaining a calculated silence. He knew that anything he said could be used against him, so he chose to stay quiet. But he was always there, following the group through the house like a threatening shadow, reminding everyone that this was still his domain, no matter how many officers were present. Martha was questioned by the sheriff in an attempt to get her perspective. The questions were gentle, carefully worded so as not to intimidate, but she remained virtually silent. Her answers were monosyllabic when they came, her eyes never meeting the sheriff's directly. It was as if she had been trained in absolute silence, as if speaking freely was something she had forgotten how to do. Edward watched sadly, recognizing in her the end result of the system that had consumed so many. Other family members were found in different parts of the property. Some worked in the barns, carrying out tasks, even in the presence of the authorities. Others remained in their rooms, emerging only when directly requested. There was a robotic quality to their movements, an absence of expression that suggested years of emotional suppression. When questioned, their answers were carefully neutral, phrases that had clearly been rehearsed for times like this one. The investigation also showed how alone the family was. Correspondence was controlled with Silas reviewing all communication entering or leaving the property. There was an extensive library, but the books were carefully selected texts that reinforced ideas about hierarchy, obedience, and traditional family order. Material that questioned authority or presented ideas about equality and individual rights was conspicuously absent. Edward pointed to recent modifications to the structure. Walls that had been erected to divide spaces, creating more compartmentalization. Windows that had been permanently blocked. Doors whose locks had been altered to lock only from the outside. Each architectural change had a clear purpose within the logic of control that governed that place. The house was not simply a residence. It was a tool of domination refined over generations. The outer barns revealed their own secrets. A quantity of work equipment suggested grueling workdays. Auxiliary dormitories where some family members were housed kept physically separate from the main house as further reinforcement of their inferior status. There was a hierarchy even in the geography of the property. Physical distance from the main house directly corresponding to status within the family. The day wore on and the snow continued to fall. The inspection became more comprehensive. More documents were discovered. More evidence of the complex control structure emerged. Each discovery added layers to the understanding of how that system worked, how it had perpetuated itself through decades without external intervention. It was impressive in its elaboration, terrifying in its implications. When the sheriff started gathering the records as proof, Silas finally spoke up. He said that those were private family papers, that keeping order in the home wasn't a crime, and that everything that happened there was consensual within the family. He picked his words very carefully from a legal point of view. trying to put everything under the protections of family autonomy that were in place at the time. Everyone in the room knew that it was a legal argument. The inspection was finally coming to an end as the afternoon turned into evening. The officials had gathered boxes of papers, made detailed notes about the house's structure, and talked to a number of family members. But there was a feeling of incompleteness, as if the property's deepest secrets were still hidden. Hidden, buried under layers that one visit couldn't fully reach. Edward remained in the main room while the others prepared for departure. He looked around, absorbing for the last time the space that had defined so much of his early life. Martha was still in her chair, motionless as a statue. For a brief moment, her eyes met Edward's, and in that gaze there was something, a spark of recognition, perhaps even gratitude, that someone had finally tried to break those invisible chains. But it was only a moment before she lowered her gaze again. The weeks that followed the inspection brought a palpable change to the atmosphere of the region. The Harrow property, once an impenetrable stronghold of secrets, was now under constant scrutiny. The sheriff had established regular visits, ensuring that conditions inside the house were monitored. It was a delicate balance between legal intervention and the limits of what the law of the time allowed regarding family structure. Silas responded to this intrusion with calculated adaptation. He did not resist, openly, knowing that this would only attract more unwanted attention. Instead, he began to make superficial changes, visible alterations that could satisfy outside observers while keeping the fundamental structures of control intact. Rooms that had previously been locked were opened, at least during official visits. Family members received precise instructions on how to behave and what to say when questioned, but cracks were appearing in the carefully maintained facade. Some family members, especially the younger ones who had been, exposed for the first time to the possibility of a different life, began to internally question the established order. These questions were silent, manifested in furtive glances, subtle hesitations in following commands, small acts of resistance that Silas perceived with growing irritation. Martha became the focus of special attention from the authorities. Recognizing her unique position as someone who could provide crucial testimony, but who was clearly under extreme psychological pressure, the sheriff attempted to establish gradual communication. He visited the property specifically to speak with her, always in the presence of other women from the town who could offer support. The conversations were slow and frustrating, with Martha offering only fragments of information, always seeming to calculate each word before uttering it. Edward remained in the region during this period, serving as an unofficial consultant to the authorities. His presence continued to be a source of tension, a constant reminder to Silas that the absolute control he had, exercised for so long, was being challenged. Edward visited the property regularly, using every opportunity to speak discreetly with family members, planting seeds of possibility, suggesting that there was life beyond those mountains. The winter of 1913 was particularly harsh. The snow piled up in deep layers, further isolating the property. During these months, outside surveillance necessarily lessened, and Silas took advantage of this respite to consolidate his control over those who had begun to waver. He held family. Gatherings where he reinforced the old narratives about the dangers of the outside world, about how family was everything, and loyalty was paramount. His words were hypnotic to those who had never known an alternative, but something fundamental had changed. Exposure to external authority, even briefly, had shown that Silas's power was not absolute, as he had always proclaimed. There were forces in the world capable of challenging him. Laws that applied even to patriarchs of isolated families. This revelation was like light penetrating a cave that had remained dark for generations. It could not be completely undone, no matter how hard Silas tried. One of the youngest members of the family, a woman named Sarah, began to gather the courage to consider leaving. She had served in the lowest position in the family hierarchy, performing endless tasks without recognition or appreciation. The sheriff's visits had planted in her mind the idea that she didn't need to accept that existence as inevitable. Edward, sensing her hesitation between fear and hope, offered to help her when she was ready. Spring arrived, bringing Thor, and with it renewed freedom of movement. Sarah made up her mind one April morning while Silas was busy in the far-off barns. She just walked away from the property, and each step took a lot of bravery. As they had planned in quiet talks, Edward was waiting on the road nearby. They set off quickly, knowing that Silas would soon notice their absence. Sarah's escape sent shockwaves through the family. It was the first unauthorized departure in years, and it represented a direct challenge to Silas's authority. His reaction was one of restrained fury, but he was limited in his options. The authorities were now watching, and any attempt to forcibly recover Sarah would be illegal and conspicuous. He was forced to accept the loss, at least publicly, though internally he plotted ways to discourage other similar defections. Sarah settled in town under the protection of the sheriff and local families who sympathized with her situation. She began working at a boarding house, earning her own living for the first time in her life. The first few weeks were challenging as she had been conditioned to wait for permission for every action to seek approval before making any decision. But gradually, with the support of Edward and others, she began to discover an autonomy she had never experienced before. Her testimony added new dimensions to the authorities. Understanding of the Harrow family dynamics. Sarah described daily life within that house with details that Edward, having left so long ago, could not provide. She spoke of the system of constant surveillance, of how family members were encouraged to report each other's transgressions, creating an atmosphere of perpetual distrust. She described the psychological punishments, the forced isolation, the emotional manipulations that kept everyone in line. But perhaps most revealing was her description of how the system perpetuated itself across generations. Those who had suffered under control eventually became controllers as they ascended the hierarchy, perpetuating the same patterns that had oppressed them. It was a vicious cycle where victims transformed into perpetrators, not out of inherent evil, but because it was the only model they knew. Sarah expressed both anger and compassion for those who remained, understanding that many were trapped not only by external control, but by deep internal conditioning. Sarah's departure had an inspiring effect on others. Family members started to talk about the idea of a different life. During the sheriff's visits, some people started asking discreet questions, looking into possibilities without making any promises. Silas could feel the ground moving under his feet. The forces that were taking away the base of his power were ones he couldn't just scare or control. Martha, who was always quiet, started to show small signs of change. She used up, spending more time at the windows, looking over the property lines. Her conversations with the sheriff became marginally more open, though still carefully guarded. She was clearly fighting with herself. Years of conditioning were fighting against a slow awakening of possibilities. She was both the jailer and the prisoner, the one who kept the system going, and the one who was hurt by it. The end of spring brought difficult decisions for the authorities. They had extensively documented the conditions on the property, collected multiple testimonies, and established surveillance. But the question remained, what constituted a crime under the laws of the time versus what was simply dysfunctional but technically legal family dynamics? The limits of state intervention in family matters were very different in that era, and Silas knew those limits perfectly. The mountains watched silently as this human drama unfolded on their slopes. The Harrow estate remained, its physical structure intact, but the invisible structures of control were beginning to crumble. It was a slow process, measured not in days but in weeks and months, each small victory against the system built over generations, representing significant progress. The summer of 1913 brought transformations that no one could have predicted. The Harrow estate, which had always been a solid block of generational control, started to show deeper fish. What had started as a small investigation was turning into something bigger, a deep questioning of the limits of family, power, and the rights of people who live in oppressive systems. Everyone in the area had to deal with questions that made them uncomfortable about what they had been silent about for so long. Martha Harrow played a big role in this change. After months of careful talks with the sheriff and women from the community who had offered to help her, something inside her started to wake up. It wasn't a sudden or big change. It was more like a slow awakening of awareness that had been hidden for a long time. She started to ask questions about her choices, what it would mean to leave that property, and if it was even possible for someone her age and in her situation to do so. Martha was able to find short times of privacy away from Silas's constant watching in the afternoons when these talks happened. She spoke in a low voice and kept looking at the doors nervously as if she thought he would show up at any moment. It took her a long time to say each sentence. It looked like she had to work really hard, like she was learning how to say things she had been taught to keep to herself. She didn't feel sorry for herself when she talked about her life. Instead, she talked about it like she was talking about someone else's life. During this time, Edward worked even harder. He set up a small fund with his savings to help family members who want to leave. The fund gives them money to start and connects them with job opportunities in other cities. His presence in the area became a sign of possibility, living proof that it was possible to survive and even do well outside of the stifling family structure. He told stories about his own journey, the problems he had to deal with, and the freedoms he gained along the way. Silas used a variety of methods to deal with these growing threats. He couldn't use direct threats anymore without getting the police involved, so he used less obvious ways. He made stories about dangers from the outside world stronger by carefully sharing them, picked stories about people who had left and were said to have had terrible experiences. He used guilt and a sense of duty to control people by stressing blood ties and family responsibilities. His speech was well thought out and used ideas of loyalty and tradition that struck a chord with people who had grown up in the system. But some family members were starting to see through these tricks. Daniel, a man who was in the middle of the family hierarchy, started to openly question some of Silas's choices during family get-togethers. His objections were polite but strong, pushing the limits in a way that had never been done before. At first, Silas was surprised, but then he tried to reassert his authority by using his personality. Daniel didn't give up completely, though, and his example gave others the courage to speak up. Things were changing in the house in both obvious and less obvious ways. Conversations that were once stiff and quiet at meals started to happen. Family members who had never been allowed to sit at the head table sometimes got invites. Silas made small concessions to show that he was flexible. But these changes were planned, trying to keep control by pretending to change things instead of really changing them. The sheriff saw what was happening and knew how fragile the situation was. Too much intervention could make people resistant and make them more loyal to Silas, but in action, the system would only work with a little bit of help. New look on the outside. He talked to lawyers in bigger cities about the type of legal situation he was in. The answers were disappointing because the laws at the time didn't do much to stop abuse that happened in families. Now that Sarah was used to her new life, she spoke out for other family members. During official visits, she wrote letters that were secretly delivered. They were messages of support and encouragement. She talked about her new life. Honestly, it showed both the good and bad things that would happen when you left the estate, which was both safe and familiar. Her words had weight because they came from someone who had gone through the same thing, not from people who were just watching. Everyone was shocked when Martha finally made a choice. One August afternoon, while the sheriff was there, she said she was going to leave the property. Not forever, at least not at first, but to spend time in the city and see what it's like. For the first time in decades, life outside those walls. The voice that made the declaration was shaky but strong, and the silence that followed was complete. Silas, who was there, was frozen for a moment before his face turned into a mask of anger. The fight that followed showed what kind of power Silas really had. He didn't hit anyone, but his words were like sharp weapons that cut through years of conditioning. He reminded Martha of her duties and where she fit in. The family, and what happens when you don't do your duties. He used nostalgia to control people by bringing up memories of the years they had spent together. But something had changed in Martha on a deep level. She heard what he said, but this time she didn't give in to it. The sheriff stepped in and made it clear that Martha had the right to leave if she wanted to. You could feel the tension in the room, generations of family conflicts with outside authority. Silas said that this was a private family matter and that outside interference was not appropriate. But his voice did not have the same strong conviction it always did. Matter, that outside interference was wrong, but his voice didn't have the same strong conviction it always had. He seemed truly insecure for the first time, knowing that the ground had permanently changed beneath his feet. That same afternoon, Martha left with only a small suitcase of her things. She was put with a good family in the city, people who had offered to let her stay with them so she could learn to be independent. The first few days were very hard. She would wake up in a panic, confused by how things used to be. She thought twice about every choice because she was used to asking for permission that she didn't need anymore. But with the help of her hosts and regular visits from Sarah, she slowly started to get used to things. Silas was devastated when Martha left. She was more than just his wife. She was a key part of the system he had built. Her presence made the family structure seem real. People thought she was okay with it because she didn't say anything. Acceptance. Without her, the structure of control he had built began to look weaker and more obviously based on force than real agreement. Family members had a mix of shock and secret hope when Martha was gone. Some people thought she was betraying them, giving up her duties, and breaking sacred ties when she left. But some people saw it as proof that things could change and that they weren't stuck in that life forever. The conversations that took place in the hallways at night. The house got busier, and whispers about what could happen in other possible futures spread like electricity. Daniel started to get ready to leave after seeing how Martha did it. He was good at carpentry, which would be useful outside the estate, and Edward had helped him make connections with builders in nearby towns. His choice was harder than Sarah's or Martha's because he would be leaving behind his own family within the larger Harrow's family. But he knew that staying would mean continuing the cycle and eventually becoming a younger version of Silas. The Harrow estate was starting to look different as summer came to an end. The buildings stayed the same, but the mood changed. Doubt and questioning were taking the place of the absolute certainty that had ruled that place for generations. Silas still had power, but it was questioned and challenged in small and not so small ways. In very small ways. He was an emperor whose empire was slowly falling apart. He couldn't stop it, but he still fought against every concession. At the same time, Martha was doing surprisingly well. She started helping out at the boarding house where Sarah worked, which gave her a sense of purpose in the job she had chosen for herself. She got better at reading, since she had only been able to read a little bit on the estate for years. She learned what she liked and didn't like. Small things, like the kinds of tea she liked or colors that made her happy. parts of who you are that have been hidden for so long. Her change was strong proof that recovery was possible even after years of conditioning. The authorities kept an eye on the situation because they knew it was historically important. The breakdown of the Harrow power structure affected more than just that one family. There were other isolated homes in the mountains, and other families were living in similar ways. The precedent being established could affect future interventions and help people understand when it was right and necessary for outside authority to step in when families were being abusive. Edward thought a lot about how ironic the situation was. He had left decades ago just to save himself, without thinking about how to change the system. But his return, which was only meant to reveal the truth at first, had caused a change he never thought possible. He now understood that real change needed more than just exposing wrongdoings. Also, coming up with real alternatives and giving real help to people who want to get away. The mountains were always there, watching in silence. They had seen the Harrow Empire grow over the years, and now they were seeing it slowly fall apart. At dusk, the mist still came down. In the winter, it would still snow, but something big had changed in the way people lived. Hope had gotten into places where only giving up had been before, and this hope was a stronger force then, more powerful than any system of control that has ever been made. Autumn came back to the mountains, ending a very special year. The leaves fell again, covering the paths with their orange blanket. But the Harrow estate was no longer the stronghold it used to be. The fences stayed. The house still stood tall against the sky. But something important had changed in that place that had been outside of time for so long. Over those months, it was clear that Silas had gotten older. It wasn't just that he was getting older. He was also getting more tired, as if the burden of keeping up a structure that had been built on decades of unquestioned tradition had become too much for one man to handle. He still had control over those who stayed, but his voice no longer had the same power. Everyone could see that there were cracks in his armor. Martha had moved to the city for good, where she found peace in a simple but meaningful life. She never moved back to the property, but she came by from time to time, always with someone else, and only for a short time. It was like she was seeing a far-off dream place that she could only remember vaguely when she visited. She didn't talk much about those years because she liked to look ahead instead of back. Over the months, other people had done what he did. Not all of them, because change this big doesn't happen all at once. Some family members stayed, either because they really wanted to, or because they couldn't get over the conditioning they had received throughout their lives. The estate kept going, but it was smaller and quieter. Silas wasn't completely alone, but the empire he had inherited and grown was definitely smaller. Daniel had left at the end of the summer and moved to a city that was a few days' drive away. He wrote letters from time to time, but not to Silas. Instead, he wrote to the people who stayed behind, keeping in touch with them in a way that was real, and not just because he had to. He told the truth about his new life, including the good and bad parts, giving those who were still thinking about their own choices a fair view. Edward stayed in the area all year because he felt it was his duty to finish what he had started. But as fall went on, he started to think about how to get back to his own life in the East. He still had work to do. It would take years, maybe even generations, for real change to really happen. But the seeds had been planted, the support structures had been set up, and it was time for him to leave. The people who lived near the property had also changed. People didn't look at those anymore. Mountains with the same holy fear as before. People were starting to realize that systems of control, no matter how old or well-known they were, weren't set in stone. People talked about other families, other situations that might have needed more attention, and other structures that needed to be questioned. The sheriff thought about the past year and felt proud of what he had done. But he also knew that there was still a lot of work to be done. The laws weren't perfect. The systems that help, not enough. But something had begun. There had been examples set. This generation had to make tools and examples from scratch, which future generations would use. The mountains stayed there, quietly watching everything. The mist still fell at night, wrapping valleys and peaks in its gray embrace, but now the fog seemed less heavy and more natural, as if it didn't have to carry the weight of terrible secrets. The Harrow estate would still be there, probably for a long time, but never again in the same way. Again in the same way. Martha looked out at the distant mountains where she had spent so much of her life while she was quietly embroidering by the window of her new home. Her eyes didn't show any regret or too much anger. There was only calm acceptance of the past and quiet thanks for the present. In the last few months, she had found something very valuable that many people take for granted, but that was a life-changing discovery for her. The simple act of making a choice. The story of the Harrow family had become part of local folklore, but now it has a different meaning. It wasn't just a story about being alone and mysterious. It was also about change and new opportunities. It was a reminder that things that look like they will last forever can change. That voices that have been silenced can find strength. That even systems that have been in place for generations can be questioned and changed. The seasons would keep going around and around. There would be a lot of snow in the winter. In the spring, things would start over. The valleys would get warmer in the summer, and in the fall, the trees would be painted in shades of goodbye. The property would stay up there in the heights, where it would be just as much a part of the landscape as the mountains. But the story that people would tell about that place had changed in a big way. Life went on for those who had left, with its ups and downs. They had scars that couldn't be seen and memories that would never go away. But they also had something more valuable. The knowledge that they had found the courage to change their situations, that they had chosen their own paths instead of just going along with what others had planned for them. There was also a quiet change on the property among those who stayed. People talked about things that had never been possible before. People asked questions that would have been kept quiet before. The future of that family was uncertain, but it was no longer set in stone by the power of unquestionable traditions. Night fell on the mountains, bringing with it its usual quiet. The windows of the Harrow house flickered with light. Life went on at its own pace, but the storms that had passed through changed the rhythms of life. And in the cities below, other lights shone, marking new homes, new lives, and new opportunities that came from the bravery to ask questions and the strength to make choices. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you think about the mysteries that live in the most unlikely places.